Yeah, we're going. Is it your turn?
It's your turn.
Okay, right.
It's my turn. It's your turn.
Right, well, one of us should say hello.
Say what?
Okay. Well,
When you open the door for somebody else.
hello, everybody. Welcome back to the vaccine conversation.
Welcome in.
No, they're back. They're back this time. We're back. We kind of took a little, 2-week break there because of the raging storm that hit Southern California last week.
We will rebuild.
Yeah. But yeah, welcome in, you guys. It's good to be back. I guess, actually, one thing I wanted to do that I had should have set up before we started rolling, I guess, is I thought it'd be fun to read some of our comments on the website. I mean,
it's so funny that you bring that up because I was going to address one of these.
Oh, you were? Oh, no. There's, let's see, where is it?
So wait, before you read any, I have to say there was the most recent review or not the most recent, but one of the ones I read talks about me interrupting you. And I'm telling you, I want to know if Dr. Bob created an alternate account to post it. I would not put that past him. So funny. I want to know if this is him.
No. Okay. Well, yeah. Well,
commenting.
Let's start with that one because I didn't want to say anything. But so
can I disclaimer? I'm Italian. Okay, this is what we do. We also talk with our hands, and you can't see that here, but that's what we do.
Yes,
we also interrupt people. It's like genetic. So what I want to say is, don't be mad at me for this. This is how we communicate. And thank you so much for your honest criticism. But there's nothing I can do.
Okay. Well.
Wait. What?
Well.
Just kidding.
So this comes from 1038574 at 3 at $4
Nice.
Nice. Anyway, these are ratings and reviews on iTunes, and again, we appreciate you guys taking the time to rate these. Informative podcast, overall good, but one thing. Melissa, I notice you seem to interrupt Dr. Bob
I can't believe you're reading this on here.
I am sure you are well-intentioned on adding or clarifying. Okay, well, anyway.
Yes, good intentions. Do you see why it makes it seem like this might be an alt account that you might have set up? Or maybe you had Cheryl, your wife, do it. Like, oh, okay, quick, just write this down because I don't know how to tell her to her face because she gets heated. Just listen to episode 8 when I called you a toddler, which I just listened to the other day. And I can't believe you left that in there either. By the way, for the record, I am not mean to Dr. Bob. I just want everybody to know I'm not mean. Nor
is there any reason for you to be mean to me.
However, I may interrupt. This is seriously how my family communicates. Yeah. I was born this way. Yeah. You can ask my husband. He will confirm these things are true. So 10659 point whatever your name is. I will do my best, but no guarantees.
Melissa, don't change.
Don't
change.
But what is the most recent one said? No, it was a comment on your thing. I saw somebody said that they actually both you and I, how we're doing things. So
yeah. There's Sarah 2552 says, loving this conversation so much. I enjoy how Dr. Bob breaks down and explains everything. It's not boring. It's totally interesting. No, but she loves how Melissa really brings forth the frustrations that us parents feel regarding these vaccine mandates.
Yeah, girl.
Yeah.
I got you.
I can't wait to hear more. Happy, peaceful. I'm very grateful that I found this podcast. I'm new to learning about both sides. This is not disappointing. Okay.
If we're going to do this, you need to read the very first one that was ever reported. Though.
Oh, yeah,
you want to go eye for an eye here.
Yeah.
Let's go eye for an eye. Let me read that one. I want to get to read that one because that one's about you.
This one?
Let me see. No,
the very first. I don't know.
No. Okay, here we go. This is ANUB is the Great. Okay.
That would be Anubis the Great.
Oh.
That's like a god of, Egyptian god of something. Anyway,
well, there you go.
Go on. I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
You sure did. What are you, Italian? Yeah. Okay, it says, would you like to spend 15 minutes of your life listening to a pediatrician read the childhood immunization schedule and blah, blah, blah. It says, then this is your podcast. It can be used as a sleep aid. That is so helpful of them to like give all, alternate usages. Said one host even notes their sound guy fell asleep during the recording. Matt. So it says if you need help falling asleep, definitely come forth. So just to be fair,
yeah.
I interrupt and Dr. Bob helps us fall asleep. So we've got it all covered.
So you're all welcome.
But anyway, outside of all that, they're all really positive.
Yeah. I just thought I'd read a few. It's kind of fun to read. We read each one of these, so keep sending them our way.
And there are comments on Facebook too, like I've seen that talk about the podcast. They really enjoy it.
Okay, well, today's topic, it's basically we're going to go through the vaccine safety research process and just kind of explain basically how vaccines are determined to be safe. What process do they go through in safety research?
Okay, I'm just waiting till you're finished. and maybe we'll even what I'd like to cover on this at the back end of this is kind of some of the problems with the safety research and maybe how it's done and why it's concerning to most people who talk about vaccine safety, and people keep going, where are the studies? And it's like, that's the point. We're trying to get the studies, and they have to be funded by somebody. And you can't just, manifest these studies. That doesn't mean the information is not out there, and it doesn't mean that a certain truth isn't what it is. It's just that it hasn't been allowed to be studied, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, there's so many things that they don't study that we wish they would. So basically, it all starts out with a company makes a vaccine, and they present their idea to the FDA, and the FDA has to approve how they're going to do the first initial research safety studies, the phase 1 studies on whether or not they work and how safe they are. So they basically work with the FDA to design these safety studies and efficacy studies. And then the company does all their own research on the vaccine. And then they, it's all proprietary, it's all their own, private research. And then they present the information to the FDA, and the FDA looks over it and decides whether or not it was done properly and met their criteria. And then the FDA approves it or doesn't approve it, and then it moves forward down the process and becomes a recommended vaccine. And we're gonna talk about all those other processes eventually, but I think this is really just more the actual vaccine approval process, the initial approval safety studies, and how they're done, and what's not done, what the drawbacks are, how they don't do it, ideally. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just was going to say, for people who don't really understand and kind of assume like, well, the FDA, this is essentially almost like a third party, as it relates to vaccines, right? This is just somebody looking out for our safety. So of course, they would make sure everything is above board and everything is done as it should be. And if there were any signs of potential danger, of course they wouldn't approve something. That would be what we would like to believe about it. But isn't it true that the FDA and the CDC, together with the vaccine manufacturers, kind of have a cozy relationship? Maybe one that does not allow for the process, as you're stating, to be objective like it should be.
Right.
That's just something to think about, because if you see something FDA approved, or maybe they've gone through all these steps and, but we checked their safety research. Is there a chance that some of that safety research was manipulated to come across a certain way? Is there a chance that some of these steps are not being really done the right way? Like, I think people should know, the FDA, CDC, and vaccine manufacturers together have created quite a bond. And so that kind of makes the process that you're saying sort of in-house. It doesn't really feel like it's completely like objective the way I would want a new drug or medical product to be tested. You think that you want it to go through the steps that you just listed, and that be like a pretty, straight process, but it's not, because there's so much other stuff happening.
Yeah, and we're actually going to do a whole show on conflicts of interest. But it's important to point out in this context, because there are some conflicts of interest in that some of the scientists and doctors and researchers that sit on that FDA approval board are allowed to hold stock in the vaccine companies. And they're allowed to do other work for vaccine companies. They can be paid by the vaccine companies to do lectures and do research. And so it is not completely objective, and we will do a whole show on that. But yeah, when you think of the FDA approving this, it is not a completely objective body. And so then what the company basically does is they have a new vaccine. Let's say, for example, the hepatitis B vaccine. The way they study it is they don't just give a bunch of children the hepatitis B vaccine by itself and see what happens. And they don't actually get a placebo, like a saline injection to test and give them this saline injection
for
to
a
see,
control group.
Yeah, as a control group to see what happens. And because that would be the most obvious, straightforward way to first test the vaccine. You only give that vaccine to a test group and nobody else, and you give them a placebo, you give another group a placebo, and then you compare all the data. That's not actually how they do that. They have the existing vaccine schedule. Say kids are getting DTP, polio, and Hib vaccines. And that basically becomes the control group, the current vaccine schedule.
So both groups get that.
Right. And then the new study group also then gets the hepatitis B vaccine. I'm just using this as an example. And this kind of varies from, with every vaccine. But the test group is the current vaccine schedule plus the new vaccine, and the placebo in quotes group is the current vaccine schedule.
Or could this also be one vaccine and the control group it gets the aluminum adjuvant?
Well, that's later. That's like one recent vaccine that we can talk about. But it's they don't test it like they do most medications.
That's what I was going to say. For a typical drug.
Yeah. I mean, you have a new drug. You have this huge placebo group that gets a sugar pill. And then you have this huge test group, and they're not getting 5 other drugs at the same time.
So why is that?
Only getting the drug.
Isn't that them saying they don't want to harm people by not allowing them to have the vaccines to save their life? That's their theory, right? And
exactly. And in fact, the CDC on their website, if you search on the CDC website, how do they determine vaccine safety, or how do they do safety research? They actually say they now have a policy that they will never allow a placebo-controlled trial because they feel it is unethical to withhold any vaccines from anybody. And so they won't even do that when new vaccines come into play. They won't allow a placebo.
They'll just keep adding them to what the schedule, what current grouping.
Right. Now in fairness, let me say there were there were 2 examples where placebos were allowed. One was the rotavirus vaccine, where they gave some like the oral rotavirus vaccine, and they gave some like a sugar solution. And then when they did a hepatitis A vaccine safety research, they actually did have a placebo group, because hepatitis A vaccine could be given not so much grouped with all other vaccines, but they could have a time frame during a child's life where you could give them only a placebo and then also give them the Hep A as a test. To get that kind of data. But that's a minority. There's 2 very small examples.
Well, it almost seems like they're picking 2 of the quote-unquote optional vaccines also that were sort of added on true. That are not considered the most necessary, the ones that have, public health crises, so to speak.
And then if you look back, something that's very concerning to me is in the 70s and the 80s, and the early 90s, they had a vaccine, the DTP vaccine, the old whole cell vaccine, which caused the most horrific reactions, and a very high percentage of kids reacted to that vaccine. Many, many seizures and screaming and encephalitis, even encephalopathy, brain damage, and many severe reactions. That was on the vaccine schedule in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. That super reactive vaccine was in that, quotes, control group, where everyone was getting the vaccine schedule with that vaccine. So when you test a new vaccine that comes in on top of that in the test group, the kids are already reacting so poorly to the placebo, you're not even going to see a reaction to a new vaccine in the test group. So
their poor reactions in the test group are going to be on par with the poor reactions in the control group.
Exactly. And then that's really how they collect the safety data is they look at all the side effects in the current vaccine schedule group compared to the current schedule plus the new vaccine added. And as long as that new vaccine didn't create any worse side effects, they say that everything's good.
Which, of course, is ridiculous because
Right.
a lot of parents listening to this are going to know that it was only one vaccine that might have caused problems for their child, one or two even. You don't have to get a full schedule of vaccines at one particular appointment to see reactions. So it doesn't really make sense to be testing things in groups like this because one of the other vaccines could be just by itself, could be the one that is a catalyst for a vaccine reaction.
Right.
And this is so not accurate when it comes to giving the idea of what risk is the relative risk for something new. And then, of course, as this continues on, doesn't it seem like the group is just going to get bigger and bigger of the totals that they're having as part of the test group and control group? Because now we've already got this massive schedule. Every time they add something to it, it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's almost like they're saying, yeah, we saw all of this happen, and it happened in both groups, so therefore this vaccine's totally safe. But they're not mentioning all the things that they saw happen and why all those things are happening.
And what's bugged me is they really should be testing the vaccine in the big groups with all other vaccines. They should be, but they should also be testing it by itself. Mm-hmm. They should start off by testing it by itself. You
And
don't
a
get
control
any
group
other
should
vaccine.
always have a placebo.
Right.
Just nothing.
Yeah. Everyone should get only a hepatitis B vaccine, and there should be a placebo group. That's how it should start. That's the only way you can learn what the reactions to hepatitis B vaccine are. And then they also have to make sure it's safe when you give it with all the other vaccines too. That should be
second phase.
Yeah, that should be an additional step. They don't do that first step, so they really can't know what the individual reactions are to these individual vaccines.
Well, also I hear so many parents that because they're they're giving their kids 6 or 8 doses at one visit. A lot of times they don't know what the vaccine was that set the child off.
Right.
And that's a danger in itself because when you aren't really certain which vaccine caused a problem, but you know it caused a problem, then you continue on perhaps giving. You might be taking out one thinking that was the cause and really it was another one and you kept giving multiple doses of that one and that was the one the child needed to stay away from. And because they're not doing safety research testing based on one particular vaccine, how are people really supposed to know what that one vaccine could add to the equation to create problems?
Yes. I guess another common criticism of the safety research process is they only monitor side effects for several days.
Right,
Some vaccines, they've monitored side effects as long as a month out.
But typically it's like 4 to 5 days,
Yeah,
right?
typically 4 to 5 days, sometimes a month later. And that is that. I mean, that just goes so against the common sense scientific approach. If you're going to
For traditional drugs, how long would they?
Oh, months.
Yeah, I mean, because anybody knows
Months, years,
the way the
possibly.
body works is sometimes it manifests at different times. What would be the purpose of a 4 and 5 day cutoff? If you were certain that there was no reaction and there was no danger, why not open that period to a month, 2 months, 3 months, and kind of see how a child's doing? Why would they do such a short time period, 4 and 5 days? That to me seems like they're trying to limit the window of when they can be accountable for something. And so if they go just past that window, that's not related.
Yeah, I think they're really only looking for immediate severe side effects.
Or allergic reactions.
Right, allergic reactions, and they're really not taking into account. There could be something that happens 2 weeks later or a month later. I guess I should give a little bit of example. Some of the main vaccines we give to babies, like Hib, pneumococcal, DTaP, and polio, were never tested to see if they were never tested alone to see what the side effects were. Kind of going back to my earlier point, those are 4 specific infant vaccine examples: Hib, PC, DTaP, and polio. They've never tested those alone to see what the individual side effects would be. And they very well could, and they just choose not to.
And we know for a fact all of them have side effects. It's just a matter of how many. Just like any other type of pharmaceutical product.
And then I guess another thing that's always bothered me is they don't test vaccines with all other possible vaccines that could be given at the same time on the schedule.
Yeah.
For example, like you can literally give the flu vaccine with any other vaccine on the entire schedule, because if, say, you're due for an MMR vaccine at the beginning of flu season, well, you'll get MMR and flu vaccine, or flu and hepatitis B vaccine. They've never individually looked to see how the flu vaccine interacts with all these individual vaccines that you could possibly get it in combination with. So some of basically all the vaccines that they have not adequately tested in combination with any other possible vaccine is DTaP, Tdap, hepatitis B, chickenpox, meningococcal, HPV, and flu vaccine. They've never studied that vaccine in combination with all other possibilities to see what those 5 might do together, or 6, or even
I think
2.
MMR and varicella were like the only time I've seen the CDC actually write, if you have this in combination with this, it's increasing the risk like this.
Right.
That's the only time I've seen it stated.
Yeah, they've studied MMR and chickenpox together because those are always given together.
And they're all live components.
Yeah, they're live, but they don't study all the possible combinations. So they don't study them by themselves to know what each individual one does, and then they don't study all the combinations so you know what getting 9 might do compared to
that's the bigger
one by itself.
Isn't that the bigger issue? The bigger issue is not just that, but that they don't actually research the combination of what everybody's getting. I mean, like they're not researching the vaccine schedule. They're giving the vaccine schedule. But even if they were to research a single vaccine and let's say they had a placebo group with a saline injection and they said, look, this one's completely safe. What they're not doing is researching what happens when you're getting everything that a kid would get, and seeing what does that do. I mean, when you think of vaccine safety, most people think, well, vaccines have been studied. There's been, the safety is kind of proven. They're safe and effective as we go back to our media sound bites. And what they don't say is the schedule your child is getting is safe. They don't say the schedule your child is getting is effective because they've never tested the schedule that your child is getting. So even if they did test one particular vaccine and say that one is safe, and even if this one over here is safe, and this one over here is technically as safe as can be. Again, we know there are reactions to all things because every body is unique. They're not testing what you get. So unfortunately, even if all their safety data showed that, let's say hepatitis A vaccine was not reactive for most people, maybe when that is combined with 5 different things, the combination of those ingredients and components in a body at one time may absolutely be reactive for some children. And isn't the goal to find out what combinations would work best? In what ways can we put these together where we reduce, if not eliminate, the potential? I mean, I know a lot of pediatricians, or many I know, try to do the MMR by itself. And they separate that from, and in the schedule it doesn't say that, obviously. The CDC schedule has a long list at 12 months of what you're supposed to be getting. But I've known some pediatricians to actually separate MMR already. And that always led me to question, what do they know about potential reactivity of this with other things that's going to make them say, you know what, let's do this one separately, just in case. We know it's 3 live vaccines. There's a greater potential risk for some type of reaction to the body, potentially with live vaccines, live virus vaccines. And yet, the combination and what we're getting and what most kids are getting has never been studied ever. It's certainly not been studied to the crazy schedule that we have now, because this is much higher than it's ever been, doubled since the year 2000. So it wasn't studied in 2000. It wasn't studied in 1985. It hasn't been studied now. It's never been studied, right? Like the vaccine schedule has never been studied.
Yeah, and then that's a huge criticism that we all have is, I like to say, you can say vaccines are safe and effective until you're blue in the face, but you cannot say we know the schedule of all these vaccines is safe.
I mean, because things react
two very different things. And I want to clarify just so people aren't confused that when you say separate the MMR from other vaccines, we still have to give the MMR together. We can't separate the M and R individually anymore.
No, the MMR as itself, separated from other vaccines.
Yeah, you used to be able to get measles by itself, mumps by itself, and rubella by itself. But you can't anymore. So I just want to clarify so people aren't confused.
They get me. They get me. They know.
Do you guys get her?
You get me,
She's
right?
kind of hard to.
You see my hands moving when I'm talking.
So one specific example of what you're saying, Melissa, is where they don't study these combinations is when they studied pneumococcal vaccine by itself or in combination with the regular schedule, they found a certain rate of seizures could happen. And when they study flu vaccines, they notice a certain number of seizures can happen. They never studied pneumococcal vaccine with flu vaccine and all the safety testing. Mm-hmm. So when they released pneumococcal vaccine into the general population and they started giving all the babies flu vaccines on the same day, lo and behold, huge surprise, the rate of seizure reactions went way up. It went so high, the CDC actually had to say, okay, everybody, stop giving the pneumococcal vaccine with the flu vaccine on the same day because we didn't know, we didn't do the safety research.
Well,
it causes a high rate of seizures.
I mean, that's so infuriating because to have to wait until people get injured to say, oh, and by the way.
Yeah, and they didn't know till the end of that flu season. So it went like through this whole flu season.
I mean, people are getting hurt,
babies
though.
had febrile seizures.
People, this is the thing, and I'd like to do a whole episode on febrile seizures because a lot of times people say, oh, a lot of pediatricians will tell you they're harmless. They're harmless, and, your child grows out of them. I had that as a child myself. Like I had a very high, in my case, it was now it makes sense.
Okay.
I had a high fever that I had to go to the hospital. And they actually put me on seizure medication until I was 5 years old, saying I'll grow out of it as a condition I'll grow out of. As if it's not really risky, I mean, I see that a lot with other mom friends, like, oh, seizures, but it's fine. It's as if the CDC tries to make it seem like seizures for MMR and varicella together, 1 in 1250, like it's not that bad. It's just a febrile seizure. But, for some kids, those types of seizures can be life altering. And so the ones that all had to go through the seizures that season when they were getting flu and pneumococcal vaccines together, they all had to be sacrificed essentially, and whatever that turned out in their lives to look like, for the CDC to finally say, you know what, we jumped the gun on this one. Maybe you shouldn't combine these. And of course, they should be, in my opinion, they should be very strict about exactly what should be combined and when. And it seems like there is a lot of room for interpretation on the schedule. When you look at the CDC schedule, it's like a lot of windows where they have open that you can get something. And so there are a lot of chances for things to all be layered together that should never have been layered together. Yes. And were never tested for safety to be layered together. But that's not really ever talked about.
No, it's not until now. Now we're talking about it. So my next criticism, and a lot of people feel this way, is sometimes the number of kids that they study in these vaccine safety trials is incredibly small. It's shocking how small it is. And some of the worst examples are, number one, the flu shot. When they approved a flu shot for use in all babies, they studied one brand in 31 babies. They gave it to 31 babies and approved it for use. That's your FDA that's approving. We're going to give the flu vaccine to 4 million babies
for
every single year, but we're only going to test it in 31 babies in the initial safety trial. Another brand, a competitor brand to that flu shot, studied it in 326 babies. And I think that's just egregious. One of the hepatitis B vaccines, there's 2 brands, but one brand only studied 147 kids before the FDA approved it as safe. The Hib vaccine, one brand, only studied in 900 kids. Polio vaccine, 1,300 kids. The MMR vaccine was only studied in 284 kids in the initial safety trials before the FDA approved it. And to me, it just boggles my mind that we're okaying this in 4 million kids every year.
But isn't it easier to say there are no effects when you've done the study in only 31 or 400 and something, and all of a sudden you're going, and we didn't have severe problems in any of these groups, so therefore it's totally fine. I mean, if the CDC says 1 in 1,250 for seizures, that you would need at least, that's just to show one.
You're not going to have a single kid have a seizure in your safety testing. No, and you're going to say, so therefore it's safe and effective. This does not cause seizures. So if your kid has a seizure after having that, because it's not something that they showed as a potential risk, your doctor's probably going to say, it's not connected to this, because this vaccine does not cause seizures, according to the safety data. Right, but we're just talking initial safety studies before the FDA approves it. Some of those side effects, like seizures, they are realized later, and they're added to the product inserts because they now realize once you've been giving them to 4 million kids, all these other side effects show up. Newer vaccines are studied in much larger groups. Newer vaccines are studied typically in tens of thousands of children. So they have expanded those test groups. But all those ones that were studied way back then, they haven't gone back and redone all those safety studies on.
And they're still on the schedule.
On 31 kids for flu vaccine. So I guess the next I guess criticism is no ongoing long-term safety research once it's approved. And that might be a whole episode in itself. I don't want to dwell on it too long, but that's what everyone wants to know. I mean, we know you might have a high fever, you might have a seizure from a vaccine, you might get temporary nerve injury, you might, have all kinds of severe reactions. People really want to know what happens to, 10,000 kids 20 years later,
chronic issues,
who've been vaccinated compared to 10,000 kids who have not been vaccinated. Not only are they not doing vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies, they're not even doing the long-term studies on the vaccinated kids.
Right.
They're just not doing
for health outcomes to be able to look and say, what is your overall health outcome or chronic illness?
And I'll tell you how they're pretending to do those outcome research. A little bit later in the podcast, but
tell us now.
Well, so I have a little section. How is the ongoing safety monitored? Like they do the initial safety testing, then it's approved by the FDA, then they use it in everybody. Then what do they do to monitor it after that? And there's basically 3 ways that they do it. One is VAERS, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, where, you have a bad reaction and either you as the parent or the doctor or anybody can send in a report of that bad reaction.
However, they do say, these same organizations will say VAERS is not reliable data, but then they use VAERS as a way to say, look, we're checking on safety. We have VAERS for patients to use. But then on the same breath, they'll say, but that's not reliable data.
You're so right. You're so right. And we're gonna actually do a VAERS episode in the next 2 or 3 episodes.
Are we? No.
We are. I know. Yes.
No way.
Yeah. So we don't want to talk about too much, but you're totally right. You're totally right. All the VAERS websites and all their paperwork and everything says this is not a reliable way to monitor side effects. But then all the pediatric newspapers and magazines and pediatric journals and pediatric meetings say, hey, don't worry, we got this great VAERS program, and that's going to tell us.
Yeah, that's going to monitor safety.
If something bad is going on, I'll actually read you the articles about that. So, but that's one way they study the ongoing safety. The other way is called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, and it was started in 1990. And it's a group of about 5 million HMO patients in which they basically gather vaccine and reactions and long-term health outcome data in those 5 million kids and adults. And they look for problems. They basically look to see if any of them are having problems with their vaccines. And they study them for years and years and years and years, ongoing. It started in 1990. So that's a really long, ongoing research program that they have. It's called the Vaccine Safety Data Link.
And does it show current, up-to-date information on all those people?
It does. But the problem is there's no placebo group. Mm-hmm. These are all vaccinated people. So they're basically looking to see, all these 5 million vaccinated people, how many of them have asthma? How many of them have ADD? How many of them have seizures?
So they can have numbers, but it's not going to mean anything.
Right. How many of them have long-term health problems? Mm-hmm. And they just look at the data and they don't do anything with it because there's no placebo group. They just have this huge vaccinated population. So it's pretend research. It's so that they can tell everybody they're monitoring this huge group of 5 million people so we can all feel better about it. But to me, it's totally bogus. Plus, it's a closed data set. Only a select group of scientists, government and CDC researchers can even look at the data. And so all of my research friends that would want to question that data, they're not allowed to see the data. So, and then the other thing is there's probably a very small group in the Vaccine Safety Data Link that are not vaccinated. Because there's got to be some of those families that have opted out of vaccinated. If you have 5 million kids, there's got to be some that are not vaccinated. They don't publish that. They don't publish any outcomes comparing all their 4,999,000 compared to the 1,000 that didn't vaccinate. Mm-hmm. And if they had good data, if they had like data that showed equal outcomes, and their vaccinated group compared to their unvaccinated group, and they all ended up just as healthy and there's no difference, you can bet they would publish
for sure.
that.
That'd be sure.
They would have to publish that, saying, look, we have this huge group vaccinated versus a very small unvaccinated group, and they're all just as unhealthy.
We've been studying for
as
28
each other.
years. And
Nothing's been published. And partly because probably the unvaccinated group is so tiny and they're in their HMO data set. But
nobody wants to publish data about unvaccinated kids in general.
I know. So
just period.
So the vaccine safety data leak, I think I just think it's pretend research. It's fake research, and I don't think it gives us any good reassurance that vaccines are safe in the long term. And then the final way they do it, there's some, I can't remember what it's called. It's like a 4-letter acronym, and it's basically 7 or 8 medical centers across the country that will undertake vaccine research projects. And the CDC will task them with researching something about vaccines, and they will do research. But it's not like this all-encompassing data set like VAERS or the vaccine safety data link. They're more like specific individual research programs. So that's how they're monitoring ongoing safety. And to me, it's everyone knows what's missing from this is vaccinated versus unvaccinated children. Mm-hmm. Tens of thousands of these children need to be put into a study. Our government actually asked the CDC to do that research about 7 years ago. And the CDC just said no. They said we won't do a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study. So we don't have it. That's really what we need if we're going to really figure out what is the long-term effects. Mm-hmm. And all the short-term effects as well.
How safe are they actually?
Yeah. What happens in a baby's first year of life if they've been vaccinated compared to a baby who's not vaccinated in their first year of life? We need the short-term research. Yeah. We need the long-term research, and it's just not happening.
Well, one of the things I was reading too yesterday in JB's book, who we're going to talk with coming up here, is about the amount of money that is spent in advertising for pharmaceutical companies is overshadowing the amount of money they spend in research and development. And the fact that they're spending more in marketing than in research, that means that there is money out there to actually do these studies, but they're choosing, it's a conscious choice not to. And the fact that they need to market so heavily and spend so much on money just goes to show you how maybe not so perfectly their products are working. And I mean, that should say something like, this is public health. We're talking about public health and about safety. What kind of product do you need to market so fiercely, advertise so fiercely just to get people to feel good about or to accept or to take, if it's not already doing that on its own? And if there are so many people concerned with safety, why aren't you appeasing some of that by actually doing the research to improve the safety? What's the downfall to making them safer? And if they have the money they're spending on marketing, that they should be spending it not on their PR campaigns, but instead on the actual research.
Yeah. And one way I would like to see that research done is again, comparing to how they research drugs or medications, compared to vaccines. There is no internal human body toxicity studies in any of these vaccine safety research approval processes. To me, it only makes sense if you're going to approve a medication, say like a seizure medication or an anti-anxiety medication, you do all kinds of internal toxicity studies. You do blood cell counts, you check liver and kidney function, you check, how's it affecting the immune system. I mean, there's so many, they do so much blood work on all these test subjects to make sure these drugs are not harming people on the inside. You could do the exact same thing with vaccination studies, because everybody wants to know, do vaccines cause any nerve toxicity? Do they suppress your immune system? Right. Do they rev up your allergic immune system? I mean, vaccines are designed to work on the immune system specifically. Wouldn't you think they would actually do one safety study to test every single baby's immune system who gets that vaccine to see exactly every parameter of the immune system, how is it being influenced by this vaccine? And they don't do any of that. That would just make complete sense. That should be the first step in safety research. And they take 100 kids, they give them a new important vaccine that we really need on the market, and they study exactly what happens inside their bodies and their immune systems instead of just giving them the vaccine, watching them for 3 days, or calling up the parents 5 days later and saying, how's your baby feeling?
Right.
They don't actually study the one thing we need to know. And that's not what are the external effects, but what are the internal effects on the immune system. And that really bothers me because we know people have done research studies on vaccines outside of the safety approval process, independent researchers, not the companies themselves, but people have done studies and they have shown immune system harm from vaccines. They've shown inflammatory chemicals raise up when you get vaccines. They've shown the allergic part of your immune system revs up and becomes a lot more reactive to everything when you get vaccines. They've done, after the fact, immune system research showing problems from vaccines. And maybe that's why they don't do any of this research initially, because they know they're not going to like what they see.
I mean, that's my feeling about the whole thing in general. Anytime you're keeping information from people and not encouraged to create that information and find out, it feels like, what are you hiding? I know I've said that before, but that's what it feels like to me logically. Like if you are totally confident and comfortable that your product is safe, you'd have no problem continuing to research.
Or doing extensive initial research instead of these tiny research studies mixed in with all other vaccines.
I mean, if I were I'd want to show, we did this over and over again and look in the same result every time. But it's almost like they're doing this small little bit here and then go, see, it's totally safe. Again, the science is settled on that one, book closed, period, end of sentence, and let's move on to the next as if that's just a fact. We've made sure this is totally safe. But like, again, because everything has to go in combination, we never know what the results might be. And because every single child has a different body, different genetic markers, everything is so different. Circumstances are different. The medical history is different. That's something a lot of people don't talk about with, I mean, in research, you can't just study one particular vaccine and even a placebo group without even thinking about what about the child's past history. Has that child already had a vaccine reaction to something else? Do they have another condition that might be triggering something autoimmune? Have they had several rounds of antibiotics already? Are there things that are factoring into how it would work for one particular child versus another? And that's not really done either. So even if the scientists are going, hey, we proved it, this one is safe, it's still not, that's like in theory versus in practice. And I think that's the big problem, is that research is not showing what's happening in practice. And in practice, you hear tens of thousands of parents complaining about adverse reactions. That's in practice. So I don't care what your research study says to me in this one little segment of, no, there's no way. Okay, so this is what you're saying, but this is what I'm hearing. This is what I see outside of it. So at some point, you have to look at that and go, okay, so this is how it's playing out. Maybe we need to look at some things. Why not make it better? I just don't understand. Why not work on making it better? You have less people like us to deal with that won't be complaining about it because it would be handled.
Yeah. So something you were just saying made me really realize something, but then I can't remember what I was going to say. It was brilliant, though.
Oh,
it was
yes.
fascinating.
I often do that too, Dr. Bob. I was going to say, you think on that. I was going to say one of the articles I pulled up in talking about vaccine safety research talked about the HPV vaccine and Gardasil and Merck, and they were just talking about how when they did the studies, the original safety studies, how they only used a 2-week period for adverse reactions. Anything past that 2-week window, they considered medical history. And instead of it being considered a reaction, they use it as medical history, which of course is not being accurate when it comes to testing the safety. And so they basically said that the system was set up to not notice potential side effects. And so when we're looking at the research process when it comes to vaccine safety, medical history is, in this article talking about, it's basically a tactic that made sure that most side effects would be overlooked because they never recorded any of these things after that 2-week period. That's medical history. That's not part of their data that they end up with as results for safety of that particular, in this case, Gardasil. And And it says in a report that they said that this was being studied in there was criticism of Merck's trial, and they were talking about this report saying that this was unconventional and suboptimal because it left uncertainty about the safety results. It did not talk about the systemic side effects that could happen long after vaccinations were given, and that's one of the things most parents are probably nodding along right now hearing this is because long-term effects are something totally different than just the acute reactions like you're talking about within that couple days or within an hour, a day or two where you're saying, oh, did you have to go to the ER? Then of course you had a vaccine reaction. And even sometimes then they don't say that that's a vaccine reaction. But what about 2 months later, something that shows up and manifests that was triggered, initially before? They're not even setting up vaccine safety research to create an environment where we can monitor that. So we don't really know that they're safe, like at all. That's not even happening, like at all. Which of course should make anybody infuriated and should make people question, well, then all the times I've heard they are safe, what are they saying is safe exactly? If they're not studying what we would think is totally normal and obvious, if they're not doing that, then what are they actually doing? And is what they are doing, is it enough? And obviously it's not enough because we still have thousands upon thousands of parents that are having their children, the children are having side effects and adverse reactions. So we know whatever safety testing that they're doing is not enough. It cannot be enough because we have too many injuries that are happening still. So their research process, they're getting through the FDA, like you mentioned at the beginning of this. They're getting through the FDA. They're getting onto the CDC schedule. So you think to yourself, this government organization over here okayed it. This government organization over here okayed it. And all the pediatricians seem to be on board. That seems like it goes through an extensive safety testing process to make sure that if you give it to your child in this combination, you're going to be fine. Your child's going to be fine. Everything's going to work out. But the truth is, there are all these loopholes happening. This is moving fast over here. This isn't actually being done. And before you know it, a few, money's exchanging hands, and all of a sudden it's on the CDC schedule. And then you just hear safe and effective overall. But objectively speaking, even if you're super pro-vaccine and you give your children the full CDC schedule, you could still listen to what we're saying and say, but that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem right. They're actually not testing them the way I thought they were. And,
yes.
I get the whole, well, my kid's vaccinated and they're totally fine. And so that seems like, we'll see, it worked. But a lot of kids aren't fine. And I think that's the point. That's why we're having this conversation.
Yeah, and I think even people who are very much in favor of the full CDC schedule, I feel like they should be on our side on this issue. On the lack of safety research.
Well, why not do more?
Acknowledge
why not do more safety research?
I wrote down the brilliant thought.
Okay, let's hear your brilliance.
But it sort of speaks to what you were talking about. They only study vaccine safety in very healthy kids. If you have a child with a medical problem, say a heart condition or asthma or immune deficiency or what have you, allergic problems, they don't study vaccines for safety in those kids. They exclude those kids from the safety studies. They just gather a group of healthy kids without chronic problems, and they give them all the vaccines to make sure that it's safe. But then when it comes to recommending vaccines, they recommend them for everybody. They recommend it for everybody with heart conditions, asthma, immune dysfunctions for the most part.
And you're saying they're only testing them in those who maybe have an easier time detoxing certain things where others might not. But then they're saying, oh, by the way, those who don't have an easy time detoxing, go ahead and load up on the full schedule because it's totally safe.
Right.
But kids like you weren't kids like them weren't tested.
Yeah, and that bothers me. Anyway, do you have any more?
Well, yeah, another part of this same HPV discussion about their safety and kind of how.
And we're going to do HPV completely by itself.
But just about vaccine safety research, it says that that they ended up finding out that the drug regulators were accused of adding aluminum to the placebo in order to manipulate scientific data. So, like I mentioned earlier in this episode. Right. Not only are they not getting saline solutions, they're getting the CDC schedule, but sometimes when they are testing individual vaccines, the control group is actually getting aluminum
Right, they're getting a chemical in their a light metal that's potentially neurotoxic,
which as an adjuvant is supposed to trigger.
Right, it's toxic. It affects your immune system. It revs up your immune system. That was the placebo.
And they're doing it though to manipulate scientific data.
Right.
Because if they did do the vaccine with a saline solution, you will see a difference there. But instead, they're doing the vaccine and aluminum, which is what most people complain about, is causing the reactions in the vaccine to begin with. So therefore, it's like it's even, and they're considering that to be indicative of safety. It's not safety. Aluminum is not safe for many children. For most children cannot detox aluminum, especially the amount that we're getting now. And we'll do an episode all on aluminum. But if you're giving if this is your type of research, then I mean this is why people say the research is so poor. So when you get into that social media argument and somebody goes, let me see your research on this, it's like, I would love to show you the research that shows what I see to be true, what I know to be true, and what we've heard people in real life experience. Unfortunately, that research doesn't exist because they are not researching in a way that would actually show safety the way that they do with comparable pharmaceutical products and interventions. So that in itself is already an issue. And like I said, whether or not you vaccinate on full schedule or not, you should still be concerned with what you have been told is vaccine safety research is not in fact held up to the standard that any type of drug should be held to make sure that your child is safe. And amazing if your child hasn't been affected so far by this schedule. That's great. But unfortunately, a lot of children have. And so, consider yourself lucky if your child hasn't had any of the things that we're talking about. But a lot of people have. And if that's still happening, then research needs to be done to find out why and to figure out what can be done about it. Not to just tell everybody they're safe and effective, don't be crazy, which is what we talked about on our one of those episodes about why you're considered uneducated if you question vaccines.
Right.
But we know that's not to be true based on research.
Yes. Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah, well, I think we've talked about all we can. Well, we could probably talk for 3 more hours on safety research, but
we're going to probably do some more on vaccine safety just overall.
Yeah. We're going to do episodes on vaccine side effects, vaccine reactions, and this is really just the safety research process and the questions and criticisms that a lot of people have.
Well, and wouldn't you say, Dr. Bob, because the science really isn't ever settled, science is always changing, we'll continue to have conversations about vaccine safety because we'll continue to learn things.
Yes.
And that's kind of the way this whole thing works. As more information is uncovered, more truths become apparent. So we can't really ever say the science is settled, safety is ever settled. We couldn't have just talked about everything in one episode and that be it, because it's always evolving.
Yeah.
And that's the whole point of why we continue having that conversation.
Yeah, and that's cool. I don't know, 5 years from now, we'll be talking about this, and we'll tell you what's new. We'll tell you what's new. Anyway, so well, I guess that's it for this episode. What is it? Episode
of the vaccine
12,
conversation.
Episode 12 of the vaccine conversation. Thanks for listening in, and we will catch you next time.
We're gonna be the peace we wanna see in the world. Yeah, be the peace we wanna see in the world. Yeah, be the love we wanna see in the world. Be the joy we wanna see in the world. Be the change we wanna see in the world.
The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice. Always consult your healthcare professional for information on vaccines and infectious diseases.